Students, hope you all are well. So today we'll discuss the pollination and the formation of seeds. So pollination means actually the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower. So this process is known as pollination. So you know that insects are attracted by the flower and they generally feeds on flower. So this sweet substance called the nectar, okay, which is released by the stigma. So when an insect, they generally sit on the flower to suck up the nectar, the pollen grains they get stuck to the part of the means to the body of the insect. Okay, so after that, when the insects they move to the stigma of a similar flower, then the pollen grains fall on the stigma. Okay, so this is how the insects help in pollination. So the pollination means transfer of pollen grains from anther of anther to the stigma of a flower. So we are generally having two types of pollination. One is self pollination and the other is the cross pollination. Okay, so self pollination, you can see this first figure, that is when the transfer of pollen grains occur from the stamen to the stigma in the same flower. Okay, that is referred to as self pollination, either in the same flower or the another flower of the same plant. Okay, either to the same flower or the same another flower in the same plant. In figure number B, you can see it is the different flower, but it is in the same plant. Okay, and another is the cross pollination. That means if the pollen grain is transferred from one flower to the another flower of another plant. Okay, same species, but that another flower is present in another plant, so it is known as cross pollination. So in the second figure, that is of cross pollination, so you can see from the anther the pollen grains will fall on the stigma of another flower. Okay, so that is the cross pollination. Now the insects are the agents of pollination. Insects are the agents of pollination. Okay, and why? Because they help to carry the pollens from anther to the stigma. Okay, and after some time, when the pollen grains have reached the stigma, means after that, when the pollen grains fall on the stigma, they break means open to form the pollen tube. That means after the pollination, means when the agents they transform the pollens, and when the pollens fall on the stigma, so they break open to form a pollen tube. Okay, they form a tube that is called very thin tube, that is called pollen tube, and the pollen tube slowly grows through the style, okay, to reach the ovary. That means the stigma and the style and the ovary part, that which this part you know. So when the pollen grains fall on the upper portion of the stigma, after that the slender portion is the style, and after that there is ovary. So how the pollen grains will transfer from the stigma to the ovary? So it is through the pollen tube. Okay, and here the pollen grains fuse with the ovules to form the seeds. Okay, so this process of the pollen grains fusing with the ovule is called fertilization. Okay, now after the fertilization, the ovary means that swollen part. Okay, so that swollen part that turns into fruit, and the newly formed seeds are present inside the fruit. So the ovary will convert into the fruit, and the ovules they will convert into the seed. Okay, so the pollination is necessary for plants as it forms seeds and also as it forms fruits. So seed contains the future plant or the embryo which develops into new seedlings. So thus, if the stigma of a flower does not receive the pollen, the flower dies, or they means no pollination will occur there. Okay, so this self pollination and cross pollination you have to learn, and what is pollination, how the pollen tube will form, and what is the function of the seeds, what is fertilization, and along with the diagram of cross pollination. Diagram of self pollination you don't need, but diagram of self pollination, the second one, that is you have to practice.